قسما بالله رب العالمين ما ارتضينا غير دين الله دين فهو دين الحق دين الأنبياء إنه الإسلام نور وضياء
هذا الدر وهذه الكلم بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار الظلم وحلا في مولده النغم.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah and welcome to Finding Me on the ITV networks. Today a very special edition with a very special guest. I have Nimanthi Rajasingham and she is from Sri Lanka originally, but she is an assistant professor at Colgate University in the US and has done some interesting and comparative work with regards to ethnicities, neoliberalism in Sri Lanka. And I want to unpack these discussions because in the last few months there has been considerable discussion around Sri Lanka and the treatment also of Muslim minorities in Sri Lanka. So I'm hoping to tap into some of her knowledge to understand exactly what it is that is happening there and what are the forces that impact on that society to bring it constantly into conflict. Assalamu alaikum and thank you Nimanthi, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So, I mean, you've just recently written a book and the study is also about Sri Lanka, focusing on ethnicities. What made you go that route?
Well, clearly the conflict in Sri Lanka, which ended in 2009, but began in 1983 and has a much longer history, was kind of the focus of the book. But what I really wanted to unpack predominantly was the relationship between ethnic rivalry or racism and its relationship to capitalism or neoliberalism, right? And I felt a lot of scholarship kind of saw racism as just, you know, like this internal thing. The Sinhalese, who are the majority ethnic group, and the Tamils, who are the minorities, just have a history of hating one another, right? And
but I want to stop you there. Can it just be a history or is there something igniting that hatred?
Well, that was part of my argument, was that what are the forces that ignite and reanimate and channel the pathways of racism and nationalism? And nationalism in Sri Lanka, I think today, has no positive connotations, right? It's really kind of the far right. It's an exclusive discourse that excludes those that don't belong to the in-group. So I was really interested in how global capitalism was shaping racism. And in Sri Lanka, so Sri Lanka opens its doors to neoliberalism much earlier than here, in 1977, and then the war begins in 1983. So there's kind of a parallel unrolling of these two formations. And I try to understand their links. And my argument is they are deeply linked. And this is not new. If you look at kind of scholars who've written about racial capitalism, right? When does blackness become codified? With the beginnings of the slave trade, right? And the plantations. How do ethnic and racial groups get codified under colonialism? You know, you've seen all these books, anthropologists taking photographs of people, fixing their identities, saying they're in certain groups, certain ethnic groups. So I wanted to understand that longer history, but how that's still alive and functioning today.
Oh, that's fascinating because, I mean, racial capitalism has become a conversational term in terms of discourse in South Africa now, only very much so post-Fees Must Fall. So prior to that, it wasn't really discussed, nor taught, nor even brought to the fore. I think there is a selective amnesia in South Africa in terms of academia and even in terms of how the discussions are held in order to bury those things that perpetuate the struggle in the conflict and to make it look like it's, you know, at the moment it's made to look like it's everything is the fault of the black government, and so you ignore the history, you know, and
the structures that are in place.
Exactly, and a continuation of those structures. So I suppose in Sri Lanka also, every time there's a new episode, it's a pretense that's, you know, the past does not exist.
Well, it's interesting in Sri Lanka, it's, I would say, a rewriting of a certain kind of history.
Okay, well, but that's also colonialist.
Yeah, and I think one of the arguments my book makes is that our notions of how we understand ethnicity is fairly new, right? So scholars in Sri Lanka have written about how the term, like Sinhalese, the ethnic group, its roots are that it just referred to the royal family. right? Because they spoke a certain variation of Sinhalese, which was quite exclusive, and they saw themselves as royalty. It only becomes like an ethnic group very recently under colonialism, right? But when the colonizers came, they kind of said, you know, here's your history book. They discovered these texts, right? And I know this is not unfamiliar here, that the British or the Dutch would, maybe the British came and said, you know, you have no history and we're going to find it for you.
Yes.
Right?
And we'll write it for you
And
too.
we'll write it for you, and we'll discover a text and say, this is your history book. We'll discover ruins and say, this is your, you know,
The legacies.
yeah. And so they rewrote a certain kind of history in which they saw the Sinhalese and the Tamils as constantly in conflict with. And imagined for us a history which I think Sri Lankans have internalized
I was
as
going to
real.
say, they started to live that history then.
Right. And I think, interestingly, during independence, we gained independence in 1947, that was the moment in which, during the nationalist movement, is in a weird way the ways that we'd been codified by others became internalized by us. So you had nationalist leaders, right, like Anagarika Dharmapala saying, oh, we hate the Muslim, we hate the Tamil. These are outsiders to the nation, even though Tamils and Muslims have lived in the country for decades and centuries. They suddenly became the exploiters and they got lumped in with the British, right? So I think decolonization, or maybe decolonization is the wrong term. The struggle for formal independence also led to nationalists internalizing some of these and then reproducing them in the post-colonial
So
period.
in other words, you know, it's what I find in South Africa too in some instances, but perhaps not as severe maybe as in Sri Lanka, where you actually internalize the behavior of the colonizer and you reproduce, so you become the monster that was,
Right.
rather than doing better.
And I would say the Sinhalese majority ethnic group, or the state at least, has reproduced some of the same colonial
Atrocities.
structures and atrocities, and, you know, in its desire. But I would say that that's an incomplete story, because it's also a story that wants to keep its power and its capitalist kind of wealth, right? It's a state where the elites want to rule by whatever means necessary. And if maligning Tamils or Muslims is the way to do it, to keep capital within and avoid redistribution of wealth, then it will.
So again, would you then say that neoliberalism as an ideology and a policy that is incorporated into the state operates largely on creating fear?
Yeah, I think the argument I make is, you know, like if you know scholars of neoliberalism like David Harvey comes to mind, they for one ignore the place of race and ethnicity in neoliberalism, but they see it as kind of the transformation of the state and the undoing of earlier periods of what Harvey calls embedded liberalism, which is when the welfare state was put in place after World War II, right? Now, I think that story has a kind of very structural mode of evolution. And I'm interested in something that this really well-known anthropologist Aiwa Ong says. She says, think of neoliberalism as kind of an assemblage.
Okay.
And by that she means that, you know, neoliberalism has certain principles. Its primary aim is restoring wealth to the ruling classes and you know, keeping capital afloat. Now, when it encounters the realities of different spaces, it will transform and work with what it encounters, right? So,
But maintaining its ultimate objective.
maintaining its ultimate objective. So if it has to do X thing, if it has to sell itself as a welfare state, it will. If it has to use racism, it will. And in Sri Lanka, when neoliberalism was unfolded and there was a war, it said, well, we'll work through and with kind of a racist state as long as it can help the ruling elite. So these discourses were adopted by politicians and the ruling elite as they needed to. right?
So I think for the benefit of the viewers, what I would like to clarify, some people will say, but how can you say that Sri Lanka is a racist state when they're all, Sri Lankans are basically, if you look at Sinhalese and Tamil, so it's of the Indian origin per se, or, Buddhists, it's not blacks, whites, Indians and Khaleds, that kind of understanding in the South African context, just to give more clarity to them, but that there are different markers of racism,
Yes.
right? Yes.
Right. So one thing to know is that till the 1971 census, the term race was used. Ethnicity is used only after that in Sri Lanka. So it's very recent, right? So we saw ourselves as, or we were defined as racist till then. The other thing is to understand that there aren't differences. Like, I
Yes,
don't think it's a
exactly.
genetic thing at all, right?
Because you look the same, you'll just speak a slightly different dialect.
So we speak different languages. Most Sinhalese are now Buddhists. Most
wow, so
Tamils are
majority.
Hindus. And there are Christians in both communities. Muslims are considered themselves an ethnic group in Sri Lanka. And that history has evolved because of during the war, certain tensions between Tamils and Muslims did occur. The separatists, the LTT, the Tamil Tigers, kind of at one point saw Muslims as part of the Tamil community and then rejected them. And actually in 1990 expelled over 60,000 Muslims from the north, the
From
city of
Tamil
Jaffna.
control.
Yeah. And gave them like 2 hours notice, or said you can get a suitcase and some stuff and you have to leave. So these tensions, and then also racism from the state, forced the Muslim community increasingly to define themselves as a separate ethnic group. The Muslims speak the Tamil language, and
So ideally they would be Tamil.
yes, and they speak the Tamil language. They've lived with
Same
Tamils for
culture, I'm sure,
centuries.
yeah.
Culturally, they have a lot to share.
Okay, so we're going to a break, but when we come back, I would just like to touch a little bit on the origins of the conflict in Sri Lanka and how you see that continuing till today. But we'll see you after the break.
بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار ظلم وحلا في مولده النغم بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار ظلم وحلا في مولده النغم.
Assalamu alaikum rahmatullah, and welcome to the second segment of Finding Me today on the ITV networks with my very special guest, Nimanthi, who is Sri Lankan born but an assistant professor at Colgate University in the US. And yes, I had a good laugh about that, as South Africans know Colgate, really Colgate toothpaste. But apparently the Colgate family sponsored a huge endowment to the university, and so the name changed. That was just on the light-hearted part of a very tense discussion. I mean, I was in Sri Lanka just under 2 years ago, and it's a beautiful country. At that time, obviously there were tensions simmering, and you hear about I think the unresolved past.
Yes.
The way the conflict ended, and the way the state continues and perpetuates itself today. But also, what I was surprised to find, and which one of our tour guides told us, was that the majority of the conflict and this animosity that originates in Sri Lanka comes not from the Tamil community but from the Buddhist community. And I mean, that's a big issue for me because of what I see happening in Burma, in Myanmar, and the treatment of the Rohingya is also this kind of atrocities, racism, conflict that is perpetuated by a group that in the Western media is portrayed as very peaceful.
Right.
So that's almost like a contradiction in terms if one
Right.
looks at it.
Well, I think that one should think about it as, any religious formation may be in the hands of dominant forces that want to use it as an instrument of power will.
Yes.
And so there's nothing inherently peaceful or violent maybe about Buddhism, except that it's been mobilized by the state and by nationalists, and this has a long history. With, as I said, as I mentioned this earlier, with independence, certain Sinhala Buddhist leaders kind of claimed Sri Lanka to be a Buddhist country for the Buddhists, protected. And so today our constitution is not secular. Buddhism is a religion of the state, right?
But while you're talking, this just reminds me of Israel, like saying
Right.
that, you know,
A certain ethnic group
yes.
is more protected than any other.
And then that the state is for the Jews,
Right.
designed by God for the Jews, but automatically asserting a sense of superiority that God has designed this for me.
Yes, and that's how Buddhism is used to say that this is one of the few Buddhist countries in the world, and it is a chosen place by Buddha, and so it is the role of the state and the Sangha, which is the Buddhist kind of priesthood, to protect Buddhists, and that other people can live in this country and have citizenship, but this country belongs to Buddhists, right? So that's been kind of the discourse leading up to kind of, I would say from 1956 was when this was kind of established into the state by S.W.R.D. Bandaranaike. He was kind of, it was interesting, he was kind of a socialist, but also a nationalist. So he practiced socialist nationalism or national socialism.
Discriminatory equal rights, that okay, we all have equal rights, but we're a bit more better than you. So we're entitled to a bit more than you.
Yes. Right, so our language, our religion, and our culture is protected by the state.
And of course, priority in terms of job opportunities, access, all of that goes to.
So in terms of the Sri Lankan conflict, one of the triggers was that in the 1970s, the state limited access to universities to the minorities. No. Oh yes, they said Tamils are overrepresented. They're 13% of the population. They're getting in more. We can't let minorities get in more.
Into the university?
Yes, so there were laws that prevented Tamils from accessing university education. Even if they had done their, we have something called the advanced level exams. If they had done that and got high grades, there were still quotas for Tamils. So there were these systematic steps put in place. And it was all done in the language of decolonization. And that's what's interesting,
that's so
right?
ironic, yeah.
Yeah, okay. To say like, oh, during British colonialism, the Sinhalese who are a majority were treated badly. Now we need to fix that.
So kind of an affirmative action.
But that means other minorities must now.
But weren't all Sri Lankans treated badly during colonization?
Well, that's an interesting question, and then again goes back to the long history of colonialism. So Sri Lanka was colonized by the British, before that by the Dutch, and before that by the Portuguese, right?
Very similar to South Africa.
South Africa, long histories. And the argument that Sinhala nationalists made was that the Tamil people in the north, Tamils are a majority in the north, in Jaffna, etc., that they were given they converted to Christianity, and therefore they had certain privileges in the civil services, in jobs, that a majority of the Sinhalese didn't get. So the argument is now we can be racist towards Tamils because apparently 200 years ago
they benefited,
or 100 years ago.
So we're trying to
equalize it. That's the argument. Of course, the majority of the Tamils did not benefit that way, right?
A few elite.
Yes, exactly. But that's used as a way of justifying.
So how did that now turn around and get transferred onto the Muslims in Sri Lanka?
So, this is when the story of kind of capitalism comes back in. So the war ended in 2009, and very unlike the case in South Africa, where struggle for rights kind of, in some ways at least formally, was realized, at least in terms of the state. In terms of Sri Lanka, the separatist Tamil Tigers had fought for 30 years. They were not a particularly progressive group, so I don't want to romanticize them. But they were decimated in 2009. It was a very bloody and brutal conflict. They say something between 40 to 70,000 civilians were killed unnecessarily. Like the state could have prevented a lot of that, but they didn't. So, of course, now you don't have a resistance struggle or kind of an armed militant group, right? And I think the war ended, and I think people in Sri Lanka thought, okay, now there's peace and things are going to be a lot better for us. Because the state had said for years, you have to sacrifice because we're fighting for you. Right. Well, now there's peace, but people's lives...
The state's not delivering.
It's not delivering.
So you find a bogeyman.
You find a bogeyman, right? The state's not delivering. The cost of living is high. You have corrupt politicians. You have massive debt that Sri Lanka is in, incurred by corruption and the war. So you have kind of a neoliberal kind of process that has literally allowed a small elite to be extremely wealthy in Sri Lanka, but a mass population to be quite poor. And you know, our biggest industries are like garment industries. We have huge sweatshops in Sri Lanka where we, you know, stitch clothes to be exported to the global north. There are all
And
kinds
no regulations.
very few regulations in these economic export processing zones. So we have these industries where people are just surviving, things aren't better. But now you know, how do you now say, well, we can't give you anything.
What
the war
we
is over.
promised,
Yeah, what are the rewards of peace? So now you find
somebody
a
to
new,
blame. Yeah.
Right. So the Muslim is a long-standing stereotype that they're traders.
Mhm.
So that
South Africa, same.
same, even though like a majority of Muslims in the East Coast, for example, are farmers, right?
Okay.
If you go to the East Coast, they're all a farming community, but they're always defined as the cunning trader. And so that discourse has been mobilized by the Buddhist far right to say, here are these Muslims, they're stealing from us, they're making lots of money, and so that they are our problem.
You know what that sounds like in the South African discourse? It sounds like the xenophobic, you know, the so-called xenophobic violence that we have in the townships. They say all these immigrants are coming in, the Somali, the Ethiopians, etc., and they're stealing your jobs, they're stealing your wealth, they're taking away the economic opportunities. It sounds exactly the
It's
same.
exactly the same. Instead of saying what are the ways in which if wealth were redistributed more equally, and we had a more equal system, an economy, then wouldn't we all have more, right? So instead of asking those questions, these nationalist forces then find a new person to malign.
This is horrible because if you think about it, there's a continuous shift of blame rather than accepting there's a certain amount of accountability to an elected politician.
I mean, I think people in Sri Lanka are generally fed up with politicians.
Okay, good, because we are too.
Yeah, I mean, they're generally, so for example, when the Easter bombings happened a few months ago, you know, the news is that the government, like whatever, Interpol had told the security forces, intelligence in Sri Lanka, and that they knew that this was planned, but that the state decided not to act, right? For whatever purposes. And then post-Easter, the Easter bombings, there have been various ways different factions have used the death of hundreds of people as just a way of political mileage. So people are fed up.
Do they know any better?
Do they know any better?
Yes.
What do you mean by that?
I mean, are the Sri Lankan population aware that these are all manipulations by the state, that we have lived together? These are not how Muslims generally behave in Sri
No,
Lanka.
so
Or
they
this is- yeah.
blame the politicians for not protecting them better, but simultaneously the
Muslim
Islamophobic discourse is very high. And
Was
of
it
course,
there before?
yes, it was. But I think the level has increased because a decade since the war ended, Muslims have been a target. And now, after the Easter bombings, there have been mass arrests of Muslims in Sri Lanka.
Wow.
Without
and I guess
reason.
with Modi's India, perhaps it's more a fueling of the same
Of
kind
the
of sense.
same. So the state fuels people's biases and feelings of hurt rather than saying this is not so. Yeah.
We're at the end of this particular interview, but I would like to say that it seems that all over the world over, what we're seeing is rise of leadership that is actually fueling more hatred, destroying the potential for humanity to live in peace and coexistence. And rather than finding accountable governance and governments, we're finding people who are becoming increasingly immoral, you know, corruptible or already corrupted when they come into power, and that power is a means of fueling individual self-glory and you know, perpetuating perhaps their own sense of self-aggrandizement. Because I mean just think of the two orange men right now, Boris Johnson and Trump, and if you look at in the European countries as well, the yellow vests have been protesting forever against Macron, but you don't even see the Western media, you know, covering these stories. They want to hide those particular disillusionments. Right. So from all of your work, what do you see? And in terms of like what is happening in terms of, you know, populations, ethnicities, leadership, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're in dangerous times, right? There's a kind of a turn to the far right globally. And I would say that we have to always watch the workings of global capitalism in all of this, because how is it that, you know, anti-immigrant sentiment, I mean, you know, in the US, you follow like children being put in cages, families separated, massive detention centers, increased racism against immigrants, but also against the African American community, against Muslims in the US, right? I mean, this increased racism and extreme hostility towards immigrants who are sometimes fleeing for their lives when they come to your country, that hostility has to be marked with the increased kind of inequalities, economic inequalities, I think, that globalization or neoliberalism has brought to us, right? Why are people fleeing? Why is there increase in inequality, instability, right? And how is that fueling racism? I think tracking those two together is something that's necessary to understand what's going on.
So in many instances, would you say that if you're looking at the conflict, follow the money?
Follow the money.
Thank you very much, Nimanthi, for sharing these ideas and giving us a little bit of light in terms of what is happening to Sri Lanka, because I think it's a beautiful country. It's just such a waste that it has to, you know, continuously be surrounded or embroiled in conflict.
Yes.
But hopefully there will be peace for all of us.
Thank you.
Fi amanillah wa assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
قسما بالله رب العالمين ما ارتضينا غير دين الله دين فهو دين الحق دين الأنبياء إنه الإسلام نور وضياء.
هذا الدر وهذه الكلم بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار الظلم وحلا في موت